Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello and welcome to the special edition of the Merryn Talks Money podcast. Now, we did have something else planned for today, something very exciting, all about longevity, how to live your best life as you age financially, but events have intervened. So today we are going to be talking elections, and how we have been very right. Well, not us, actually, but one of our guests completely right on when the election would be. So with me today, I have John Stepek, as usual. Thank you, John. Hello. Also, Helen Thomas, CEO of BlondeMoney and a macroeconomic consultancy. Helen has been with us on this podcast very recently, where she predicted that there would be an election on July the 4th. So we've got her back on to explain why she was right and what she expects to happen now, because we are now completely reliant on Helen's forecasts. Also with us today, Tom McPhail, who's Director of Public Affairs at the Langcat, and is going to talk to us a little bit about what might happen to your personal finances over the coming years. Right, welcome everybody, and thank you. Helen, can I start with you and ask you, you were right. You were mostly right. I mean, another part of your prediction was that Rishi would have to give up, that he would be gone and he would be replaced by the charming Penny Mordaunt, and she would be the one who would lead the country into the next election. That didn't happen, but you did get the date absolutely bang on. So what do you think happened here?
Thank you very much, Merryn, and thanks for asking me to come back to chat further. I mean, I think the key here was the updated information that we got in terms of the data on the morning of this election announcement, because we got not only that inflation figure, but we got a public sector net borrowing requirement figure, which is all about the budget deficit. And the whole point here with this is those pieces of information showed that Rishi Sunak's spreadsheet wasn't going to add up. It wasn't going to allow any kind of fiscal giveaway. I mean, frankly, that was likely anyway, but it's just sort of the nail in the coffin, because the budget deficit figures were bigger than expected. And although inflation had come down, it wasn't by quite as much as expected. That was going to delay Bank of England rate cuts. It was all turning into a situation where it was all going to get worse with time and not better. And that was sort of the central thesis of our analysis of why we thought this election was coming sooner rather than later.
Okay, so the idea that things can only get better from here and therefore it's worth waiting until they get better and better is gone. It's not going to get better. He isn't going to see better numbers. So it might as well be now there isn't going to be a better time. Yeah,
that's the upshot. He couldn't get legislation passed. There's all these little things that were going on, like he couldn't, he faced a rebellion on criminalising homelessness. He faced a rebellion on student visa cuts and all of these things. He's got defections. He's got by-election losses. Time wasn't on his side. And then the data was the final nail in the coffin. Yeah, and he hasn't got the support that he needs. And as you said last time, he's not entirely sure who his enemies are and how many of them there are. Well, yeah. And the other thing that, events, dear boy, events, we've seen, toxins in the water. There's scandals left, right and centre. Over time, you just get more and more chance of bad news stories, not good news ones as well.
So is there any risk that there won't be a clear Labour majority? Of course, there's some risk, but do we need to take it seriously?
I mean, things can happen in campaigns, as we've seen. However, the lead is so large for the Labour Party and so consistent. I think that's the really key thing about this election campaign is there's been a campaign for well over a year and voters made their minds up a long time ago. So we're in it's all been shadow boxing really. And so that's why it makes it more unlikely. So I always put it like this, which is the Labour Party have a large mountain to climb, because the last time around they were on their worst results since 1935. They're on a low number of seats, but all of the data and everything they're doing suggests that they can easily scale the mountain and get to the peak. So I think the thing, core scenario we're looking at, we're still running the numbers and analysis on this, but, Labour having a majority of at least 30 or 40. And of course, going into it, Keir Starmer is suddenly just going to look like he's got so much power. So that first few months, he's going to have a lot of power and be able to do a lot of things.
Okay, so here we have Keir Starmer arriving into 10 Downing Street with a huge majority behind him. 6 months in which he can basically do whatever he wants. Anything at all. What's it going to be?
Well, not exactly, by the way. I think we've talked about this before on the last one, Merryn, which is that, the shadow of Liz Truss and the gilt market crisis looms very large over everybody. And the financial markets have, came back with an absolute bang in terms of their impact on politics, and not just the Conservative Party. So it's quite an interesting point, that, because, I just said to you that the numbers show Rishi Sunak's spreadsheet wasn't going to add up to a fiscal giveaway. Well, it's going to be the same numbers when Rachel Reeves opens up the books. Then you get into the politics of it, which is, do you then come in and say, let's, got to bury it all on the previous administration. It's far worse than we thought. The numbers are horrendous. We're going to have to do some really, tricky things up front. And then in a year's time, it looks like, oh, look, the numbers are better. We, buried all the bad news. Now we can start to do some more stuff. So that's actually the key sort of political judgment in those first few months, is how much does the market constraint bind them? And I think what's going to be interesting here is that budget's going to be coming in the autumn. We're going to have that US election coming up as well. Where are interest rates going to be? We've already priced out loads of rate cuts in the, G3 world. It's going to be fascinating to see if they can be bold in the face of quite a binding constraint, because politically they can be, but economically, is that the reality?
Okay, so interesting. So those first 6 months, he might not get to use the political power that he has. And we might find that none of the things that some of us might find frightening financially won't happen.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing to look at when I was running the numbers on this, with the potential for this, what's going to look like, this Labour government. So one of the other important thing that Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney, his chief of staff, or the guy who's run his campaign, have done is made sure that the candidates selected for Labour seats have been extremely loyal to Starmer and, really support the project. If you run the numbers, if Labour win as many seats as Tony Blair did in terms of a net gain, then half of the Labour Parliamentary Party will be new MPs, completely new MPs. And so that's, by the way, that's good and bad. So great, they came in on they owe this to Keir Starmer. That show, they're going to be loyal and supportive. But a lot of them have not got any experience and have had careers in other things and might want to stand up and call out their big pet project for how to solve the world.
I mean, having careers in other things in advance, that can't be considered to be a bad thing. But one of the things that I've experienced, one of the things we've seen in Scotland, is that when you have a parliament jammed full of people with no political experience, it doesn't always work out that well.
Well, no, and of course, this new parliament, as you've discussed many times, is, probably the biggest political and economic challenges for, well over a decade, if not several decades, given where inflation is.
To my mind, this constraint is actually not real. It's something that has become a nice story, but really the gilt market fell over because defined benefit pension funds were over leveraged. And now that that's been unwound, Britain has got exactly the same constraints as any other developed economy, really. We can't go as far with the credit card as the US does, but we've definitely got room. So I'm just wondering, at what point does Labour, having got into power, start to walk back that idea that, we need to be really careful because markets will mess us about? Or alternatively, do they use that as an excuse to say, well, actually, we need to raise taxes because otherwise the market's going to, batter us over the head because we've got such a big, deficit and debt built up?
I think you've picked the 2 points there. On the second one, that would be a potentially politically expedient path. As you say, you could use that constraint, whether, well, indeed imaginary or otherwise, to prosecute a path that you want to go on anyway. But in terms of this sort of bigger question about, can they basically let's just forget about it. Like you say, in many ways, it was a narrative that built up and, we're maybe in a whole new world come, what will it be? July the 9th, not that far away, when Parliament will reopen. No, because a couple of things. There's still the shadow of Jeremy Corbyn and the concept of, can Labour be trusted with the economy? Yes, they're doing a lot better on that with the public, but that's only in sort of recent history. They feel themselves as a party, perhaps, that they sort of have slightly more to prove. They may have won that credibility, but they've seen how easy it can be lost, so they need to keep it. And then, the other part to it is, I said that Obviously, a lot of MPs would be new. Well, look, I mean, Keir Starmer's not been an MP for that long. His previous job was a lawyer. I mean, Rachel Reeves has got some real world experience and, of course, Bank of England experience. But that just means that they're more aware of those kinds of constraints. Here's the thing. I always say business is about what works. Politics is about what sells. And that first sort of 3 months of that Labour government is going to be, we've said Starmer will be powerful. We've said there's an imaginary narrative you could bust. What we don't know is how bold is he genuinely prepared to be right now, because we do say what the analysis suggests. I don't think he will be that bold. I think that constraint is still very live for this generation of Labour politicians.
All this rather suggests that there are tax rises coming. Tom, when you look at an incoming Labour government, what do you see as happening first? What's going to happen to the personal finances of people in the UK first? We're going to see reversals of the national insurance cuts, rises in income tax. Where do we go?
Yeah, all really good questions. And I think, just building on Helen's point, I think the size of the Labour majority is critical. If you want to push through change, you need one of three things. You need either a crisis like we had in 2010, you need lots of political capital like Tony Blair had in 1997, or you need a consensus around what the path forward is. Everybody agrees that this is a good policy, then it's quite simple to push it through. So the size of the majority and the amount of political capital that Keir Starmer has to work with is critical in shaping how bold he can be with his plans, which is kind of the point that Helen was making. So in terms of our taxes, Rachel Reeves has been studiously avoiding any hint of any tax rises because she doesn't want to get beaten around the head with that during an election campaign. So the public position is we're not going to raise any taxes. Everything is fine. You're safe with the Labour Party. Everything will be, business as usual. In fact, look at these nasty Tories who've been raising all these thresholds and fiscal drag. And in many ways, life will be better under a Labour government, I think, is their starting point. But it's the points that have already been made. Financial position of the country isn't great. I think there's some ideology starting to come into this. I want to pick out one thing, which is the lifetime allowance, the maximum amount you're allowed to build up in your pension pot. One of the few areas where Labour have publicly spoken about what their personal tax policies might be. Jeremy Hunt announced a year ago he was going to get rid of the lifetime allowance. And as an aside, the HMRC have made an awful mess of executing that plan. It's a nightmare, and that now creates pitfalls for anyone who's thinking of taking money out of their pensions, and that is important. Rachel Reeves has publicly said we will bring back this ceiling on the amount you can build up in your pension pot. So immediately there we're faced with the dilemma of, should I wedge more money into my pension now before a Labour government arrives so that I've built up this money in a safe pot that they will then have to protect because you can't make taxation retrospective? Or is the risk that they'll just bring back that limit anyway, and the money I've been putting into my pension pot will then get taxed more punitively?
Because there is this very small window at the moment. If someone is in a position where they are, thinking of retiring, should they be looking to say, I know, take their full 25% tax-free lump sum now, or, line it up before the autumn budget? I realise that these are the kinds of things that you can't say anything definitively on, but in terms of preparing for a potentially more hostile, because we know that pensions are they're a sitting duck, aren't they, for politicians, because people don't pay attention to them until they've got them. So
yeah, I mean, for two reasons. One, yes, because as Merryn says, that's where the money is. And they don't just want the pension fund money because it can put money in the exchequer now. They can raise taxes off pension pots, since we saw in 1997 with Gordon Brown's tax rate on pensions when they came into power back then. They'll be thinking in those kind of terms again. But also for the reason I touched on before, ideologically, this is about shifting the burden of taxation away from the workers and from income tax and more onto capital, and to tax those baby boomers who've built up vast amounts of wealth and are now hoarding their cash. So I think we might hear more of that kind of mood music on the other side of the general election. And to your question, I think, yes, it's really difficult. I think in general principle, get your money in your tax shelters now if you can. So the more money you can put into pensions now, the more money you can put into ISAs now. It makes sense, because generally they don't make taxation retrospective. My caveat with that is, this question of taking money out again, I'm also concerned that Labour were never that keen on the pension freedoms that were introduced by George Osborne in 2015. The change to the rules that meant you could just dip into your pension pots and take all your money out whenever you liked. Rachel Reeves, who was working on this beat at the time, was never happy about that. She commissioned a review of the pension freedoms, which was published in 2016, which said, look, basically, they've gone too far. And I think there's plenty of data to suggest that for many people, there are a lot of risks now in how they take their money out of their pension pots. So I think one thing we might see on the other side of the general election with a Labour government is more restrictions being reintroduced in terms of how and when you're allowed to take money out of your private savings, possibly edging up the minimum age at which you're allowed to access your pension pot, or bringing in some requirements you have to secure a minimum level of safe income before you're then allowed to take capital out as you are under the current rules. So to your question again, there's perhaps an argument that says, well, if you're planning on do it sooner rather than later. I've already mentioned the complications with the lifetime allowance that have been introduced as a result of the abolition of the lifetime allowance and the cack-handed way that was implemented by HMRC. So anyone thinking of doing anything in this space, I would absolutely encourage you to go and talk to a financial advisor, because it is tortuously messy and full of pitfalls.
We're almost looking at possibly going back to kind of forced annuitization at a certain level, potentially.
I think the system that pertained before 2015, where it wasn't forced annuitization as such, but you had to demonstrate a minimum level of secure income, state pension, defined benefit pension, annuities. And once you were, the whole argument here is make sure you're not a liability on the welfare state, that, you have a secure income for the rest of your life, and then fine, do what you like with the rest of your capital. I think we could move back in that direction a bit without going all the way to forced annuitization again. And the one other thing that I think is a glaring outlier in terms of pension taxation generally, one is they're currently exempt from inheritance tax. And the rules for anyone who dies before the age of 75 are ridiculously generous. It's a very easy way to pass wealth on through the generations. So I wouldn't be at all surprised to see a new Labour government introduce more in the way of death taxes on people's accumulated pension pots, perhaps, for example, by making them liable to inheritance tax. The more nuclear option is they look at pension tax relief more generally. And they've said they're going to do a review of pension taxation. Look, there's £50 billion a year up for grabs there. This is not chump change. This is serious money. So there's nothing to stop Labour saying, look, George Osborne had a look at it in 2015 and it's difficult and complicated. And then he made a mess of Brexit. So there was that. So they never carried through with their plans. But I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Labour government coming back and saying, hang on, why are we giving all this generous tax relief to high earners, to the 45 and 40% taxpayers? Shouldn't we be redirecting a bit more of that money towards the lower earning, more deserving workers amongst us? So it would be a big thing to do, but it wouldn't. And that, I think, comes back to Helen's point around the size of the majority. But, I wouldn't be surprised to see Labour bringing the whole pension tax system out onto the table.
So beyond maximising your allowance this year, there is nothing that you can actually do about that.
There's no magic wand you can wave here. No, unfortunately not. And you've either got the money or you haven't. And if you have, then think about how you can apply it most effectively now. I think talking to employers. I think the other thing we might see is some movement in the workplace pension rules. Perhaps a bit more pressure brought onto employers to increase the amount of contribution they're obliged to make to people's workplace pensions. That seems to me a no-brainer. But again, that's not a personal tax issue. That's not something that you can preempt as an individual.
How do they square the circle with the defined benefit side of things? Because another thing that's come up a couple of times is the whole point of scrapping the LTA, or the political reason for doing it, at least, was to stop doctors from leaving the NHS because, they were getting paid too much and being hit with tax charges on their DB pensions, because their DB pensions were it's so generous, really. So the question then is, how do they carve that out, or what do they do about that without creating even more of a two-tier pension system, basically?
Yeah, really good question. There's two things there. One is they bumped up the annual allowance to £60,000, which partly addressed the problem of the taxation of doctors and their pension benefits. The irony is last year, we still had the lifetime allowance, but the government had just done an emergency measure of turning the tax rate down to zero. right? So it still existed, but it had no effect. What they've done now to completely take the lifetime allowance off the statute book, to eliminate it completely, has actually made the world a great deal worse. So if we just stopped where we were last year, life would have been a great deal better. And what we had last year had solved the problem. So it had eliminated the risk of doctors sort of leaving. The tax punishment had been eliminated. If Labour were hell-bent on bringing back the lifetime allowance limit, they could do it at a slightly higher level. They say 1.5 million, 1.8 million, which is the level it got up to under the previous Labour government. They could do that, and the problem would be solved, and the totemic reintroduction of the lifetime allowance would have been achieved. So it would have stopped the very large amounts of pension pots being accumulated tax-free. So I'm not sure at the moment whether they will actually bring it back at all, and if they do, what level they'll bring it back at. I think it might become part of a broader pension tax review endeavour.
One of the things we haven't talked about, which could change the numbers, is if we got some sort of return to growth. And this is where actually Tom's point about ideology is key, because if you look at Rachel Reeves's May's lecture, which I think I mentioned on the last podcast, and her Securenomics, the whole idea is that capitalism itself breaks the whole system down, and only if you take a more statist, socialist approach can you get growth. Because, this point of Securenomics is, if everyone feels more secure, then everyone will have a much better life and will have growth, etc. And one of the things I think will be quite interesting is in those first few months, simply because of a new government with a stable majority, or at least what looks like one, removal of uncertainty. We've got a bit of growth coming back in Q1. Inflation has fallen back down towards Bank of England's target. Could there actually be those first few forecasts from the OBR may show some, nascent signs of growth? And that would slightly change the sums, because I don't think it will be, of course, a life-changing. I don't think we're coming into a roaring period of growth for the UK economy, but that could change the picture quite dramatically, or at least how Labour decides to approach the situation. Because even with growth, they might decide they want to do some of these things Tom's talking about.
Certainly give them a bit of wriggle room, yeah.
Well, it would then mean they could, rebalance the economy in favour of, certain elements they find more deserving, or at least rebalance from capital to labour, as Tom was pointing out.
I mean, rebalancing from capital towards labour is not necessarily a bad thing, because obviously the pendulum kind of had swung the other way quite a lot. But it's partly about how you kind of go about it.
I should say, by the way, that on one level, we haven't actually had much capitalism for the last 14 years on a strict basis, bailing out the banks, QE, all the rest of it. So, I mean, the direction of travel, the Overton window of possible policy has shifted more economically to the left anyway.
Well, and actually, just on that point, I find it fascinating that when you look at the speeches from Jeremy Hunt and Rachel Reeves around this question of directing pension fund money to invest in UK economic growth, you'd be hard-pressed to tell who had delivered which speech, right? They're absolutely on the same page. Helen's Overton window is exactly in the same place there. So whatever happens on the other side of the general election, I can't see an outcome where we don't get the politicians leaning on the pension system generally to channel more of its investment capital into British enterprises, British startups, venture capital, infrastructure, unlisted equities. That is going to happen. It's just a question of how hard they get lent on.
That's a really good chance to jump onto the other thing I wanted to ask you about, is the British ISA. So obviously they introduced the idea of this, but one of the kind of threats that a general election raises is that it's never going to happen. But that doesn't sound as if, do you think it's still on the cards? Do you think we'll still get it?
I can tell you the whole industry hates it. Certainly all the industry I've spoken to think it's an absolutely daft idea.
John and I love it. I love it.
Well, so I think
it's just because you guys don't like the admin.
Well, I think that's part of it. How do you define it? Is it on top of the 20,000? Do you have to do the 20,000 before you can then do the 5,000? What do we define as a British ISA? Is it shares listed in the UK? Is it earnings in the UK?
Come on,
All that kind of stuff.
Complicated questions to answer. I mean, is it on top of the 20? Is it not on top of the 20? Someone tells you that and that bit's done. How do we define it? We define it as listed in the UK, just like we used to with PEPs. What we're trying to do is deepen and widen UK capital markets, right? That's it. It's not all the precision of all your earnings in the UK. It's, hey, come and list here, be part of our capital markets, and let's get the infrastructure around those capital markets working again. That's what it's about. It's not about, are you a machine maker in the Midlands? I think the industry wants to make this complicated because they don't want to have anything that's so precise, right? But I think these are all very easily answerable questions. Anyway, that's not John's question.
Yeah, that's very fair pushback. And in the context of everything I'd said about the pension system, maybe there is a consistent logic there that yes, the Labour government will push ahead with something that looks like their version of the British ISA. Obviously, can't be the British ISA because that was the Conservatives' idea. So we'll do something that looks very like it, but is our idea. So yeah, perhaps they'll push ahead with that.
And particularly, they do keep talking about listening to the radio the morning after the election was announced. There's all this talk about, nation before party. And a Brit ISA kind of slots nicely into that little bit of ideology, doesn't it?
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Tom, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you feel we should, in terms of things that we should worry about, or let's be clear, things we might be excited about with the new government?
So, without wishing to disappear too far down into the weeds of it, I think there's quite a lot of challenges for the pension system there around the demographics, around the sustainability of the state pension. But these are all long-term stuff. So we're going to see a review from Labour on pensions. We've touched on some of the things that might get dragged into that review. I'm not sure how broad it is. I actually really hope that they will take the time to take a step back and say, OK, let's do what we did back in 2005 with the Turner Commission. Let's take a proper look at what the challenges are here, because there are some really big challenges, such as the demographics. And let's think about what we want the pension system to look like in the future before then pushing ahead with all of their plans. So maybe we'll see that. I think one thing I'd look out for is, I've mentioned already that they might look at bumping up the age at which you can access your private pensions. I think there's some unfinished business on the state pension, and when that gets paid, we know it's going up to 67 by 2028. This is not exciting stuff, by the way. I'm just saying that these are the things that might come into play. The age and shape of the state pension could be up for grabs, I think, in the next Parliament as well.
Okay, none of that suggested that you're particularly excited, Tom, about the prospect of a new government. Helen, is there anything that you can think of that makes you go, wow, this could be great? They've got a policy here, either that will be transformative to the country's finances or our personal finances. Anything that you can say, actually, I'm pretty excited about that. Not a trick question, by the way. Not a trick question.
I think I'm fascinated by some of these institutions that Rachel Reeves has talked about creating. There's great British energy, of course, is one. I mean, clearly we need to do something about our energy policy. I mean, that has been obvious for years, but rammed home these last couple of years. So I'm quite interested in what great British energy will actually do at the margin for actually our energy security as much as anything, because that threat isn't going away.
Okay, John, you're just not looking excited. It's one of those podcasts where we've got video, and I can see that John is casting around for something exciting in a new government. Come on, John, got to be something. Got to be something. No, there isn't.
I mean, no, but I just worry that we're going to have another X years of some weird kind of stasis and an awful lot of fighting around the fringes of things without getting anything done. And, we might get a Labour landslide, but, we had a Conservative landslide as well. And to be fair, actually, Brexit did get done, and that has been a big shovel load of stuff to get through. And maybe if Labour get in and they actually sit down and think about things rather than being as reactive as the last few governments have been, the headlines, then actually maybe we could get somewhere on the more substantive issues. But, it's everything like house building, planning reform, which partly ties into the Great British Energy thing. I do think it's important that they have a kind of business-friendly atmosphere, because the FTSE's just finally getting going. It'd be nice to see that continue. A big bid for
Well, we have talked before, haven't we, John, about how a solid majority from Labour would be incredibly positive for the UK equity market, because regardless of people's expectations around policy, nonetheless, they would see it as some kind of stability, and that's what the UK needs. And, of course, a little bit of backtracking from Brexit.
Stability and, as you say, a sort of like general continuation of the kind of easing of relationships with Europe. Because to be fair, I mean, Rishi Sunak's presided over a more hospitable relationship with the EU, and that's also partly because the EU itself has now got far bigger worries than just, its relationship with Britain. It's got the fact that all of the major countries now have significant parties that they're not going to say they want to exit, but they're certainly not pro-EU parties.
Well, just to say, July 17th is going to be the state opening of Parliament, and July the 18th, I believe, is the conflab meeting of the new European political community that Macron has been keen on in London. So you could get a shift from the very start in the relationship with Europe.
Okay. All right. Now, let's move on to, we've talked about this. I think we've covered pretty much, well, I haven't covered everything. We've covered an awful lot. How does the ordinary person out there who's now totally panicking about their pension, thanks for that, Tom, how do they react in terms of investing? John, what do you think? You go out and you buy a nice FTSE 250 ETF just in case? Not a recommendation, by the way, just looking for suggestions.
Just stuff your pension in your ISA as much as you can. Use your allowances if you can. Beyond that, I guess this is the other irritating thing. Your pension ends up being at the mercy of whoever is in power, and you can use the bits that are accessible to you. But from a big picture point of view, there's not that much you can do, and a lot it depends on your financial position right now. And really, if you're not already using your allowances, then it's probably because you don't have the money to fill them up, rather than because you've been, sitting on your hands waiting for something to happen. Yeah. But if you have been, then, act now.
Anything, Tom, Helen, to finish us off, anything we've done an attempt to be optimistic. Is there anything that we can do right now that might be financially advantageous over the coming years?
Well, I'm going to go with the spirit of optimism and just add that, I think back to 97, and I think Blair's comment subsequently was he wishes he'd been more bold in that first term, given the majority he had. So to echo the point's been made, a big majority actually could be quite exciting. It could help to get things done. Some of the things that John touched on there. So yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I'd also echo John's comments about, using your allowances, because I think there are likely to be more capital taxes on their way. So, you make hay while the sun shines, I think, is the answer there.
And hope it keeps shining, Helen.
I think I just want to throw in, last time I was talking to you, I liked US tech stocks, and that's still the case. But here's a thought now, which is, what about the currency? So we just talked about a situation where actually, risk premium coming out of UK assets a little bit in terms of a solid majority and removing uncertainty could be a bit of a boost to the pound. So if you are investing overseas, maybe think about currency hedging back into pounds.
Okay, useful information. Thank you very much. And thank you, all of you, for being with us today at such short notice. We really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Money. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, if you like our show, rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And keep sending questions or comments to merrynmoney@bloomberg.net. Also, thoughts on the election, thoughts on politics, thoughts on what might happen next. All very welcome. This episode was hosted by me, Merryn Somerset Webb. Many thanks to Helen, to Tom and for John for joining us. It was produced by Sam Asadi. Additional editing by Blake Maples.